What the city is talking about.
The news that impacts you.
Welcome to the Montreal Now podcast.
With Aaron Rand and Natasha Hall.
Welcome to The Week That Was here on the iHeartRadio Network. I'm Aaron Rand along with Natasha Hall, and this week we'll take a look at these stories. Have you ever wondered how different generations were affected by the pandemic? Did one do better than the other? Is one looking more forward to things than the other? Well, that's exactly the question asked in a brand new Leger poll. We'll get to that story coming up.
And this was definitely one of our most eye-opening interviews that we did this week. Dr. Peter HOTEZ was nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize last year. He's warning people about the anti-science movement and how it could be deadly. In some ways, it already has been. We also spoke to the new federal minister of immigration, Mark Miller. One day in the not-too-distant future, it may be possible to take an oath of citizenship with just a click of a button. But it was supposed to happen back in June and hasn't yet. Will it ever? And of course, we also had to ask for the minister's thoughts on the House Speaker's resignation.
And speaking of the Speaker's resignation, when Anthony Rota stepped down, the next big question became, well, who would be the next Speaker? One name that was brought up more than once was that name, Anthony HOUSEFATHER. We had a chance to speak to him and found out, first of all, whether he'd be interested, and second of all, how the process actually will work to select a new Speaker of the House. So Anthony HOUSEFATHER, who of course has been in the news a whole lot over the last couple of weeks, now of course in the wake of the House of Commons issue, the scandal, if you will, that has forced the Speaker of the House to step down. We want to try to find, a lot of people are asking the question, well, what happens next? How is this process going to work to replace Anthony Rota? Anthony was kind enough to come on and explain this to us. Anthony, thank you for being here this afternoon, as always.
Thank you so much, Aaron and Natasha, for having me.
Explain how this process works. I understand it's a secret ballot, right?
It is. The way it works is that every member of the House is automatically a candidate unless they withdraw their name, because nobody's ever supposed to run for Speaker. They're actually supposed to reluctantly take the position. So nobody actually puts forward their candidacy. Everyone else just withdraws theirs. So for the moment, all 338 names are on a list, and then we will all sign forms if we don't want to run, withdrawing our name. Those people who are still candidates on Tuesday morning of next week will each make a speech to the members of the House, and then the members of the House will have a preferential ballot where they will elect a Speaker, meaning you will put your choice number 1, choice number 2, choice number 3, 4, however many choices you want to take. And until somebody secures a majority, the last name on the ballot will be eliminated, and their votes will be reallocated to their second or third choices, depending.
So that's on Tuesday. What happens between now and then?
Those people who are interested in being Speaker will be heavily lobbying all of the MPs from all of the parties, because this is a position not chosen by the Prime Minister or the government. It's chosen by the whole House. So I have a number of colleagues who are anxiously running for this position and, doing their best to lobby for votes.
It's not an easy job, though. I would imagine it's pretty all-consuming. And I've heard the pros and cons of having someone from your own party be the Speaker. Can you speak to that, please, Anthony?
Sure. I mean, it's a very important job because you're running the House functions. You're running the Parliamentary Protective Services. You're running the administration of the building. You're running the translation, and the interpretation. You're running the budget. You have a lot of responsibilities as Speaker of the House or the Senate. And most important, in making sure that you protect the rights of members, allow them to have vigorous debates, keep the rules, and make interpretations when people, have complaints. It's a very, very legalistic administrative job, but it's one that really is divorced from policy, meaning when you take that job, you're sacrificing your right to speak out your views about bills. And so people need to make a very stark choice. It's a very important role, but for example, for somebody like me who's not near the end of my career, but rather in the middle of it, it would be something that would be totally uninteresting because I would be unable to speak out on behalf of my constituents or the English-speaking community when something like C-13 happened, for example.
Of course, with all due respect, when you do, I mean, we know what happened there. You lost the parliamentary secretary job, but that's the price. Can I ask you though, is that something you expected would happen?
I honestly, as I told you when we talked about it in the spring, I had no real expectations. I understood that these jobs are at the pleasure of the Prime Minister, and that whether or not it would cost me personally, the vote was more important. Speaking out on behalf of my constituents was more important, and that was something that I still feel, and in fact, I've never felt 1 ounce of regret about how I voted.
Can
That's
I
good
ask
to
too,
hear.
have you heard from your constituents? Because I can tell you we have.
I have been so flattered and so, honored to have received so many supportive calls and emails from not only my own constituents, but, English-speaking Quebecers from across the province. It's been, when something, sort of upsetting happens to you when you're down and you get all of those people reaching out, it definitely changes your perspective on things.
Can we ask, just for your reaction, how disappointed are you that Anthony Rota had to step down and that this whole situation unfolded as it did?
Oh, on the Anthony Rota side, of course, he needed to step down based on what happened. But I also wanted to point out that I've, known him for the last 7 years as a colleague. He is a very kind, fine man. He made a terrible mistake, but I hope his career won't only be defined by this moment, but he absolutely needed to step down because this was an international embarrassment for Canada and definitely incredibly hurtful to the Jewish community, all those communities who, from Eastern Europe who had people that were killed by the Nazis, the Roma, gays and lesbians, and Ukrainians across the world. It was just a terrible mistake. And of course, it deeply embarrassed his colleagues who, stood up and clapped for somebody who fought with the Nazis. I was fortunate not to have been in the House at that moment, so I didn't stand up. But, I can't imagine, based on what the Speaker said, where he said this man is a hero, that you wouldn't have stood up. So I'm just lucky I wasn't there.
Look, we're going to run out of time. I will ask you, as you laid it out a minute ago, you're saying you have to pull your name out of contention for this job. So I'm going to assume by what you said, Anthony, that you will be doing that, or have you already done that?
Already did that this morning. You sign it, so you can either sign a paper or you can send an email.
Okay, and you've already done that.
Yeah.
Okay. The only other thing I would ask you, what's a job like that pay as Speaker of the House? A little bonus? What is it? Do you know what it's worth?
I honestly don't.
Oh.
I mean, every member of Parliament gets X amount,
right,
which I believe today is something like $180,000, and then there's stipends for
other jobs,
all these offices that like, being a cabinet minister or a speaker. And the speaker, I'm sure, would be on the higher side, but I have no idea what it actually is.
Okay. One last thing, because I'm so nosy. Since this whole thing happened with you losing your parliamentary secretary, have you actually had a one-on-one with Justin Trudeau?
I have not had a one-on-one with him. No, I have not had a one-on-one.
Just curious.
Are you hoping to have one?
Maybe dinner, lunch?
I mean, he's got to know you're disappointed.
I've seen him multiple times, and I think given what's happened last Friday, he's kind of busy right now, but I'm sure I will have a conversation with him.
Anthony, I know it's heartening to hear that people reached out to you, not just from your own constituents, your own riding, but from across the province. So good for you. I think we all agree you did the right thing. Yeah. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you so much, guys. Great to speak to you.
Take good care. Anthony HOUSEFATHER, no, he will not be running for
His name did
Speaker
come
of
up.
the House. Yeah.
Informative,
interactive,
and always interesting.
This is Montreal Now with Aaron Rand and Natasha Hall.
This was definitely one of our most eye-opening interviews that we did this week. Dr. Peter HOTEZ was nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize last year. He's warning people about the anti-science movement and how it could be deadly. In some ways, it already has been.
I came across this article last week, and I know that every time we talk vaccines in the wake of COVID, of course, it can get a little, what's the word I'd be looking for? Ornery?
Volatile?
From people, because there are people out there, as we know, we learned this during COVID, who are not on board with the idea of vaccines in general. But then you read something like this. Our next guest, nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize last year, by the way, is warning people that the growing anti-vax movement risks undoing the world's progress against not just COVID, but infections as common as measles and even whooping cough. His new book is called The Deadly Rise of Anti-Science, A Scientist's Warning. Dr. Peter HOTEZ is on the line. Doctor, thank you so much for being with us today.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Well, let me ask the question. So you're a pediatrician. You've been involved in vaccines and, for much of your life, I guess. And when you read a warning from someone, who has done this for so long, that basically says, we could reverse all the successes we've ever had in the last 2 decades by virtue of the fact that this anti-vax movement is growing stronger by the day. That's a pretty grim outlook.
Yeah, it's I tried to find silver linings in the book, but they were hard to find. This is what's happened in the United States during the COVID pandemic is extraordinary in the negative sense. 200,000 Americans needlessly perished because they refused a COVID vaccine, even though vaccines were widely available and more than 90% protective against severe illness and death during our Delta wave in the last half of 2021 and the BA1 wave in early 2022. And so when you talk about 200,000 deaths that could have been prevented, you say, wow, that's really extraordinary. And then it gets even more difficult to talk about because you have to talk about politics, which we don't like to do in science and medicine. But the reality is this, most of those 200,000 deaths occurred in what we call red states, red being Republican, blue meaning Democrat, and the redder the county, the lower the immunization rate and higher the death rate. And so that we call it misinformation or infodemic as though it's just some random junk that people happen to come upon on the internet, but it's not that at all. It was organized and it was deliberate by members of the elected members of the Congress on the far right, House Freedom Caucus in the House, the certain senators, certain governors, like the governor of Florida. And then it was amplified every night on Fox News, and they document, from two groups, Media Matters and a research group in Switzerland, how those nighttime Fox News anchors every night falsely discredited the effectiveness and safety of vaccine. And so it started with the Conference of Conservatives in July 2021. They said first they're going to vaccinate you, and then they're going to take away your guns and your Bibles. And as ridiculous as that sounds, people in my state of Texas and neighboring states bought into that and refused to get a vaccine. They were victims of a predatory movement on the far right.
I think about where this lack of trust began. I mean, I can understand people, unfortunately, wanting to jump on the bandwagon and use it for their own purposes. But I think about, prior to the movement that vaccines cause autism. I remember when I first started hearing that and thinking it was absolutely ridiculous, and yet it gained speed quickly. Was there a time before that, or was that really what started the lack of trust towards vaccines?
Yeah, I think that is how it began, I believe. And I got involved in this because I have 4 adult kids, including my youngest daughter, Rachel, who has autism and intellectual disabilities. And a previous book I wrote is called Vaccines Did Not Cause Rachel's Autism, and which debunks all the phony stuff that anti-vaccine groups were saying. And that wound up making me public enemy number 1 or 2 with anti-vaccine groups, but it also gave me a front row seat to this, and I watched it morph or shift from falsely discrediting vaccines saying they cause autism to becoming a political enterprise on the far right. And by it being adopted by a major political party in the United States, that gave it incredible strength and power, and you saw the full force of this in the death and destruction that it caused in terms of so many Americans losing their lives. And now we're exporting this stuff. We're exporting it to Canada. We're exporting it to Western Europe, Central Europe, even low and middle income countries. And so I met with the World Health Organization towards the end of last year to sound the warning that as bad as things have been, the globalization could mean that things are much worse, and they're spilling over to all childhood immunizations.
When you try to deal with this topic, sometimes, as I said off the topic, can get a little wild because different people had different ideas. I would ask you one thing, and I know this came up a lot at the beginning when people said, who were anti-vaxxers, if you will, said there's no way this vaccine, first of all, it was developed too quickly. There's no way it is what they say it is. I'm sure you were confronted with that as well. What was your answer to that in terms of people suddenly becoming scientists and deciding that, no, this vaccine developed so quickly can't be real. It can't be good for you. It must be dangerous.
Well, the reality is it really wasn't developed that quickly. It was done at the same time frame all the other vaccines were. So we started developing coronavirus vaccines more than 12 years ago and identifying the spike protein as a target and how to deliver the spike protein. But that kind of flew under the radar screen. And I think what happened there was the CEOs of the company, in order to, when they release press releases, they're not trying to impress you. They're trying to impress their shareholders and want to make it seem like what they've done was extraordinary. And it was in a sense, but it wasn't so different from what had been going on in the last 12 years. And it was tone deaf to what people might perceive as just something that must be rushed and maybe not adequately tested for safety. None of that was true. But, some of the messaging from the pharma companies are partly to blame for that as well.
And what about to the question of, people point this out all the time as well, side effects from this particular vaccine from COVID? I mean, we have that from all vaccines. Why do you think that caught on?
Well, I think part of it was so many people got immunized at once. We haven't had an adult immunization campaign at this level. I can't even think of a precedent in modern American history. So so when you have tens of millions of people getting immunized, even if it's a tiny subset that have adverse reactions to the vaccine, it's still a significant number. So I think the fact that we had an adult immunization system that was never used to doing anything on that scale and how to manage that, I think that was also part of it.
Are we just stuck with this now? Like this anti-science movement is here to stay, or do you ever see it ending or us turning a corner somehow?
Well, in the past, what's happened is when kids weren't getting their immunizations at the level we wanted, we'd see breakthrough measles or whooping cough, and parents in the community would see their kids being hospitalized or in the intensive care unit, and there'd be this kind of self-correcting mechanism or autocorrection where there'd be a catch-up vaccination campaign. But, with 200,000 Americans needlessly dying, I'm not seeing that. In fact, what I'm seeing is kind of a doubling down from far-right groups wanting to falsely claim it was the vaccines that killed Americans, not COVID, or that the scientists invented the virus. So there's this kind of doubling down and whitewash or revisionist history going on, and that's also very troubling.
Well, what have we learned now? I don't want to run out of time. With respect to COVID, so we know now where we are, there's another campaign that will start in the fall in about another 2 weeks from now. With respect to COVID itself, do we know much more about it now than we did, say, 2 years ago?
We have. We've learned a lot about that the spike protein is the most important target for the vaccine, and we now can measure the new variants that are emerging. So the new booster or annual immunization that's now was just made available to people in the U.S. and soon Canada targets those XBB variants. And those are the ones that are rising right now in terms of causing hospitalizations. It's important people get it because if it's been so many months since you've last gotten your immunization, there is some waning immunity. The hope is that this could be the last gasp of COVID-19. Maybe yes, maybe no, but we'll see. But in the meantime, while you've got these new variants circulating, this is the best immunization to take.
And it should be done in conjunction with, here we now have free flu shots. We didn't before. So just if it's available to you, get it.
Yeah, get your get your annual flu shot. And here in the United States, if you're a senior, there's a new vaccine for respiratory syncytial virus, RSV. So we're going to be looking at a bunch of new adult immunizations that'll be made available. There's already Shingrix for shingles and Prevnar for pneumococcal disease, and that's a good thing because it can extend your life. I
would ask one last question. Perhaps this is a bit unfair, but, going through what we did in COVID, and you consider the last time that happened was 100 years ago, right, during the Spanish flu, I wonder, do you think we ever get back into a situation like this again, given the fact that we're able to develop vaccines as quickly and efficiently as we can? Is that something we still have to worry about?
Well, it's going to be a situation, I think, where the technology outpaces our social and political institutions that we have to manage it. So, if there's another pandemic, whether there's another major coronavirus over the next decade, as many of us think, or a new avian or zoonotic influenza or some other virus pathogen, I have confidence that we can develop vaccines very quickly. The question is now, with all the negativity around it, will that be a showstopper? Mm-hmm. And will we continue to see low uptake? And that's the way it may play out.
Yeah, because if you're making them fast but nobody wants to get them, what difference does it make?
Yeah, the number of Americans who took the bivalent booster last year was only 20% of those eligible, and we're starting to see similar numbers probably for this one. So, what makes us think it's going to be any better when the next emerging pathogen comes along?
Dr. Peter HOTEZ, the book, by the way, is called The Deadly Rise of Anti-Science, A Scientist's Warning. Doctor, I want to thank you so much for your time. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much. My grandfather's from Montreal, so I'm a Habs fan. So.
There you go.
Awesome.
Even better. Say hi to your grandfather. Yeah.
Informative,
interactive,
and always interesting.
This is Montreal Now with Aaron Rand and Natasha Hall.
Have you ever wondered how different generations were affected by the pandemic? Did one do better than the other? Is one looking more forward to things than the other? Well, that's exactly the question asked in a brand new Leger poll. We'll get to that story coming up. This is the largest Canadian study ever done, highlighting trends that influence Gen Z and millennials. And it's always interesting to see what other generations are doing, thinking, and in this case, reacting post-pandemic. So we're talking about more than 3,000 members of these generations surveyed here. Christian BOURQUE is Executive Vice President of Leger, doing this poll, and he is on the line. Christian, thanks for being here today.
Hey, my pleasure.
Let me begin with sort of the big overview here, because the one word, in looking through the part that I saw, and by the way, the study is called 2023 Youth Study Report, the word pessimism seems to pretty much permeate this study, at least from what I've seen.
Oh, yes. And there's two categories where we see a dramatic shift, even from last year. The first one is about the impacts of climate change. Already, these two generations are the ones that are most concerned with the impacts of climate change, being younger, of course. But then we're seeing plus 8 percentage points from last year, which is most likely due to the extreme weather events we got over the summers, the wildfires, and all that we saw across the different provinces of Canada. I think it's sort of driven a heightened sense of urgency among youth to sort of do something about it. But at the same time, when we ask them if they trust our governments and our large companies and enterprise to actually do something about it, we see that there's a declining level of trust among young Canadians as well. Aside from the environment where we do see the big shock is the affordability crisis that we're all going through, but it's hitting youth even more. For the first time, we see a significant increase in the number of millennials and Gen Z who say, I just live paycheck to paycheck. It's now a majority of them at 51%. 73% says, I cannot save. I struggle to actually put money aside to potentially buy a home later. Half of them, 48%, say, I'm now struggling to actually pay off my credit cards. And 72% of those who rent say that their rent is taking too much space in their monthly budget, where they do need to, make or to cut back. 20% of young homeowners said I needed help from my parents to help pay for my mortgage. All of the economic indicators here are showing that young Canadians are struggling more than they ever have economically.
As depressing as that may be to hear, I wonder when you look at this kind of study, and when you hear the number, and I know it was released earlier in the week, 51% of people in these groups say that, yes, they live paycheck to paycheck, which seems like an incredibly high number. When we look back, if you go to a previous year's study, when's the last time, or can you quantify when that would be, that we saw numbers like this?
We've never seen this. In terms of their perspective on the economy, these are the worst numbers we've had in 7 years doing this study. Even pre-pandemic, while housing was still fairly expensive, numbers were not as bad. And the number that sort of gets to me most, we sort of reacted more emotionally to that because I do have Gen Z children, is 55% of young Canadians believe they will be poorer than their parents. When I grew up, my parents were convinced, and I was convinced I would have a better life than they had. And generations before that, this was always the outlook. My children will do better than me in life. And it's the first time that young Canadians say, no, I think I will have a worse life economically than my parents, which I think shows again, either it's a degree of pessimism, to some extent maybe a degree of realism, because housing was not like that when their parents were actually looking to buy their first home.
This idea that they're feeling insecure on so many levels, right? Like about climate change, like you said, finance, their own situation, the future. I then find it interesting because we've spoken so many times about millennials being, not having sort of commitment phobia when it comes to jobs. They're constantly changing jobs. And this poll finds that 15% of Canadians intend to quit their job in the next year. Is that higher or lower, Christian? Because that struck me as a little low, actually.
Yeah, that's a lot lower than during the pandemic when we were at the height of, the labor shortage. Everybody was talking about how much opportunity there was in our job market. We had that same figure at 25% just 2 years ago, and then it sort of sharply declined with the growing sort of percentage of young Canadians who feel that we are or that we're heading into a recession. So they're staying put maybe a little bit more, and as well we measured in a different survey. But we also now found a third of young Canadians who are afraid they may lose their job. So in that situation, stability is probably the better option.
Yeah.
That's why we're seeing that number of young Canadians who want to sort of play hooky and switch jobs is, in fact, significantly lower than just 2 years ago.
I wonder, too, if the fact that they're living paycheck to paycheck, right, means they simply don't have the luxury of looking for another job and having a couple weeks without a salary coming in.
Oh, certainly. And actually, we looked at what they were looking for in their next job. And, of course, they're looking for more money. Money is a reason to leave a job, but it's not necessarily the reason why you want a job at a certain place. We find that about half of their decision to leave and get a new job is tied to money, to financials. The other half is tied to the different perks, different benefits offered by that job, flexibility in terms of scheduling and where they will have to work. There's other elements than money, but right now money is extremely tight.
You know, the thing that I want to harken back was what you started at, Christian, this idea of, they think things are getting worse as far as the environment is concerned. Yeah, I think we all get that. But what's really sort of, I guess, sad in a sense here is the fact that they think as you said, between, enterprises and government, they're not very hopeful that any of this is going to get addressed. That's pretty grim.
Yeah, and even when we ask a series of questions about how they feel about how we will resolve the different issues affecting their lives, 62% of young Canadians said, I feel powerless when it comes to the problems plaguing our society today. So we're just hoping they won't give up on making this kind a better place.
Yeah, we need them. Good grief. But I think hopefully politicians will wake up here and feel and recognize that this generation
or who knows, maybe this will take this generation to go into politics to try to do something, because they don't trust politicians now to address this to begin with. That's, as I said, pretty sad. Yeah.
It's very stark.
Christian, I want to thank you so much for the time. Fascinating study. If you want to sort of find out more, you can go online, I guess, to, was it leger360.com?
Yeah, it's available for free, the full study.
Excellent. Thanks so much for your time.
Hey, my pleasure.
All right. There you go. I don't know. It's funny. You're kind of, when whatever age group you happen to be in, you talk to people who are like-minded because they're roughly the same age as you, and you don't realize. I think a couple of things he said really kind of strike me, even though it's not new, but to hear it actually be said in a study, like, for example, can you remember, I would wonder when the last generation to say that they didn't think things would be better for them than the previous generation. Like, how far back would you have to go for that to even be a thought?
I would say it started with Gen Xers, though, to some degree, because boomers did so well. We started to feel like, holy moly, do we stand a chance? And I think many of us were late to launch, right? It took us longer to get going, but we're getting there, and we are, doing okay for ourselves. And I feel like that the next generation below us feels like that there's just no hope that they will actually get there.
So you're a Gen Xer. Did you remember feeling that way 10 years ago or even?
Yeah, I certainly did. Yes, I did. I felt like the opportunities weren't there. I felt like I wasn't going to be able to succeed. Now, I'd say a little longer ago than that, probably in my late 20s. I was like, I don't know.
Afford a house, build a family, that kind of a thing.
Yeah. Yeah,
because,
and I would say many of my people my age, Gen Xers, felt the same, but we kept on trucking, and it's coming to us a little later than it did for previous generations.
It's interesting.
But we're getting there, right? And this next generation just has no hope that they will ever actually get there.
Yeah. See, I never even thought of that so I'm older than you are, so I'd be in the boomer generation, and I thought my parents, after a war, we know how difficult it was to basically start a life, be able to make a living, afford to buy a house, and we thought there's no way it could be this hard going forward. So maybe that's where the cutoff is in Gen X. He's bringing up an interesting sort of idea that even back then for you, think about the housing market 20 years ago, it was not that expensive to buy a home here.
No, it wasn't. It was great.
But yet you were feeling that way already. Yeah,
well, and some of us made some dumb decisions and didn't, and hindsight.
She said, pointing at herself. Okay.
Informative.
Interactive.
And always interesting.
This is Montreal Now with Aaron Rand and Natasha Hall.
We also spoke to the new federal minister of immigration, Mark Miller. One day in the not too distant future, it may be possible to take an oath of citizenship with just a click of a button. But it was supposed to happen back in June and hasn't yet. Will it ever? And of course, we also had to ask for the minister's thoughts on the House Speaker's resignation.
We are joined right now by the new federal immigration minister. He's also Minister of Refugees and Citizenship here in Canada, Mark Miller. Mr. Miller, Minister Miller, thanks so much for being here today.
Thanks for having me on, Aaron.
We haven't spoken in a long time. This is now you in a new job, in a new capacity within this government. But immigration is a subject that's gotten a lot of headlines in the last little while. And most recently, and it's something we talked about on the show, this idea that we're looking at international students, so many of whom come to this country, and deciding that, okay, maybe it's time to consider putting a cap on the number that are coming here, even though the government doesn't want to change its overall immigration numbers for people coming into Canada. So where are you on this subject?
Yeah, and first off, it is an exceedingly important subject because of the what these international students bring to the country. First, they're a huge financial asset, between 20 and 30 billion to the country. So it's not something you can just in one sort of fell swoop turn off the taps, because it has impacts on the institutions that drive the economy of Montreal, for example, but across the country. But obviously, we've seen increases year over year in the last few years that are alarming. First and foremost, because you want to make sure that these people can get a proper education and they're actually here for the purpose that they get the visa for. And often, what we've seen is that on the margins there are, there's an ecosystem that's been created that has perverse incentives, but there's also fraud. And so my job as an immigration minister is trying to figure out what I've got to solve for. I'm not the police of underfunding by provinces of post-secondary education, but I do have to worry about the integrity of the system, and that means I'm going to have to work with a number of provinces, some that are doing a good job, some not so great, to make sure that we rein this in to some extent, and make sure that we are actually rewarding good actors and punishing the bad actors. And there are bad actors. What I don't want to do is do something that's unintelligent and actually creates more of a problem than it solves. And while the idea of a cap is interesting, just because in how simple it is, this is going to be a complex thing to solve, and it's going to have to be done in phases with various levels of implication of provinces and institutions.
Well, with all due respect, it sounds to me a little bit like we're scapegoating foreign students here, because this idea, well, they're not all coming here to get their education and some of them are doing nefarious things, that's really never been raised before. But suddenly, with the whole immigration issue now being raised in terms of how many immigrants we're letting into this country, now it seems these students are going to bear the brunt of whatever ramifications come. Do you kind of buy into that? Because that's what it sounds like to me.
No, not at all. And in fact, it's important to be clear here. I don't want to be demonizing international students. They are a huge asset, an intellectual asset, and in some senses will be the future of this country. A lot of them choose to leave, and they're soft ambassadors of Canada and really make us shine internationally, which is really, really important. But unfortunately, in some areas, they've been given false hope by some bad actors in the country, institutions that have said, you can come here to this country and get this type of business education, and they end up driving Ubers for $100,000 in student charges over the course of their education. That's not what we're trying to do as a country. We're really trying to leverage some incredible assets that we have to compete with other countries to bring into Canada. So the last thing I want to leave the impression is that we're scapegoating these students who are some really bright minds. Okay. But unfortunately, because of the lucrative nature of this, there have been some bad actors in the system that we need to kind of weed out, and those institutions need some sort of reckoning. And that requires not only my involvement, but those of provinces and the actual institutions that are promising or making false hope for people abroad that they can come to Canada, stay here, maybe become permanent residents. And that, you don't want that, because it does tarnish the reputation of the good actors.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I want to ask you one thing, and then we want to get to the idea of citizenship oaths and stuff. But this question now, the government's agenda with respect to how many people are going to bring into this country by over the next 5 years, big numbers, 500,000 people. And I guess some people are wondering, because the argument's been made, you've heard it, we're in the middle of a housing shortage in this country. We keep bringing in more people. What's the point? They have nowhere to live. They're taking space away from other people who still can't find homes. How do you square that circle?
Yeah, look, I'm not going to ignore the volume, and clearly I look at the reports that are issued by the various banks as to what the impact of this volume is. But clearly we often make the mistake that we only look at the demand side of immigration, i.e. they're demanding houses, and not the supply side. We need people with skilled labor to actually build those houses. The Ontario government has said as much. I often cite the mayor of Halifax, who says that the current face of Halifax today wouldn't be so without Lebanese migration entrepreneurship that has built a lot of the modern face of Halifax. So we often disregard the supply side of things. Clearly, it's something I think we can do. But when people say, let's reduce immigration, I ask them, what exactly? Do we want to reduce those economic migrants that are almost solely responsible for the increase in our gross domestic product? If you look at the entrance into the workforce over the last year or so, over 90% is due to immigration. Do we close our hearts and harden our hearts to those who are seeking refuge in Canada, fleeing from war and oppression? I think the answer is no. So that number is significant. It's something that I think we need to face as a country and have a conversation as, and even adjust within those categories. But I think it's something we can do, and we can actually face this challenge of building houses and getting roofs over people's head. When I got into politics, Aaron, in 2015, the interest rate on debt was pretty free, but there was a housing challenge in Montreal for some of the most challenging communities in homelessness, and that's something I continue to fight for as an MP and as the Minister of Immigration. But it's not something that came out yesterday. It's the result of successive governments underinvesting, both federally and provincially, in housing over the last 30 years. So I'd be loath to blame immigrants or the larger volumes these days for a problem that has many faces to it.
Okay.
All right, let's talk about the oath of citizenship happening with just a click of a button. This was potentially supposed to be happening as of June. Where are we on that plan, and does it look like it's a reality?
That option's still on the table. Canadians have asked us to speed things up, and I know the lag in all the processing times the federal government, including Citizenship, has been heavily criticized, and rightly so. I largely lead a department that hasn't really adapted to the 21st century, and the preference at all times is to make sure that we're doing this in person. I would encourage anyone who has the opportunity to go to a citizenship ceremony. It renews your faith in Canada. The preferred option is to do it in person, to swear the oath, and to recognize the seriousness of the moment. But options like Zoom and doing it on the internet is not something that I'm ready to exclude, because there are rural, remote regions where we ask people to move and drive perhaps hundreds of kilometers to go to a citizenship ceremony, where they could do this in all the same seriousness on the internet. I think that's important. There was a news story the other day about Chief Roos, who was fighting the wildfires, who did it on Zoom in what looked like his fire truck. That's really cool, and he became a Canadian citizen. So that, I don't want to exclude those options, but again, the decision isn't taken on sort of what has been called sort of the one-click option. But I do concede that it has not been unanimous in the review of it, and there has been some legitimate criticisms of people perhaps taking it for granted, and that I do. That I do take seriously. I mean,
certainly, Minister Miller, the idea of being able to save people up to 3 months of processing time, that's got to be a huge advantage, a huge incentive. I'd like to ask you about Roxham Road, back in the news again lately, with the dismantling of that and the fact that people are still coming in, but they're finding different routes, and more than ever, people are flying in. So it actually kind of puts people, if they're in a financial position, they can still come across and get in, and those who are not are perhaps being put more in harm's way. Could I ask you to comment on the latest situation with Roxham Road?
Yeah, and closing of Roxham Road was more of a closing of statistics and wasn't getting rid of the problems. We don't encourage anyone to migrate irregularly to Canada, but obviously we recognize there's wars and famines across the world, and the world hit an ominous number of 100 million people that are displaced across the planet last year. And it's not something that's going away. I think we've all seen scenes of in Italy of mass irregular migration, the impact that has on communities. Canada isn't immune to that. We're geographically lucky and blessed to have a huge country that has an ocean on each side, block ice in the north, and a nuclear superpower to the south. But we do see migration, and we have to do it in a way that Canadians expect us to deal with these issues when we are faced with them, which is in a humane and humanitarian fashion. So that involves planning, involves making sure there's a roof over people's head, and dealing with this in a way that we faced any challenge as a country currently. And I don't want to hide that from anyone. We will see some of the largest numbers this year of asylum seekers, but I think we can process this in a way that is both humane and humanitarian. But the federal government can't do this alone. And it's funny, we just talked about international students. And when I talk about that, provinces say this is their exclusive jurisdiction, because it's big money. And when we talk about asylum seekers and refugees, they say it's entirely the federal government's responsibility. Exactly. What's the difference between the two? One has money, the other doesn't. So we all have responsibility in this, and I think it's something that can be done in a better fashion than we've done up to date.
Minister, before we let you go, we would be remiss if we didn't ask you what you thought about the announcement earlier this afternoon of the House Speaker, Anthony Rota, stepping down.
Well, look, particularly in the wake of the high holidays, this was a disgraceful event, an embarrassing moment in our history, and I think Anthony did the right thing in recognizing his responsibility and in stepping down. I've known Anthony for years. He's fundamentally an honorable and a decent person. Is unfortunately going to be defined by 3 or 4 days in his life. I wish him well, but he did the honorable thing at the end of the day and stepped down, and it is the right decision. And we'll have the opportunity in the next 3 or 4 days to elect a new speaker, because the business of Parliament does have to go on. Federal Minister of Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship, Mark Miller. Minister Miller, thank you so much. Appreciate your time today as always.
Thank you.
Thank you both.
That wraps up another edition of The Week That Was here on the iHeartRadio Network. I'm Aaron Rand, along with Natasha Hall, and we will see you next week.
Have a great week.
This has been the Montreal Now podcast with Aaron Rand and Natasha Hall.
Listen live on your radio weekday afternoons from 2 to 6
on CJAD 800
or through the iHeartRadio app.